Το τελευταίο πάνελ του συνεδρίου μας για φέτος. Έχουμε τη χαρά να έχουμε μερικούς εξαιρετικούς κορυφαίους στην Ευρώπη αναλυτές, ειδικούς για την οικονομική διακυβέρνηση και για την ευρωπαϊκή οικονομία, οι οποίοι θα μας μιλήσουν για τις προκλήσεις και τις προοπτικές της οικονομικής διακυβέρνησης στην Ευρωζώνη, κατά κύριο λόγο. Θα παρουσιάσω τους ομιλητές και θα ξεκινήσουμε με τις παρουσιάσεις μας. Απλώς να ενημερώσω ότι υπάρχουν έξω ακουστικά όσο τον έχετε πάρει και τα χρειάζεστε. Θα συνεχίσω από εδώ και πέρα στα αγγλικά για να διευκολύνω τους ομιλητές μας. Θα υπάρξει και ευκαιρία για ερωτήσεις και συζήτηση στη συνέχεια. We'll start with Iain Begg. Iain Begg is a Professorial Research Fellow at the European Institute at the London School of Economics and Political Science. His main research work is on the political economy of European integration and EU economic governance. He has directed and participated in a series of research projects on different facets of EU policy, and his current projects include a senior fellowship funded by the British Economic and Social Research Council on European economic governance, research on the political economy, the fiscal policy coordination in Europe, and work on the future of the EU's cohesion policy. He's going to talk to us. As all the speakers had, he has a free, if you like, pass, let's say that way. We did not direct the speakers on their presentations, so we wanted to get what they believe are the most important facets of the challenges and prospects of Eurozone's economic governance. Iain, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, and kalispera, everybody. I hope the projection will come on to what I'm going to show. Can we arrange this?
Μπορούμε να έχουμε την παρουσίαση, παρακαλώ, στην οθόνη.
It's gone blank now. Okay, thanks very much. Well, thank you very much for the invitation. I'm going to try to tease out some of the challenges that are implicit in the title, but also think back to the causes of the crisis and whether we've managed to resolve them sufficiently. Now, in the psychobabble manuals of how to deal with grief, they talk about the following things that you can see on the left here, the 5 stages of grief when you have a bereavement. And I think that they may have an intriguing parallel with the 5 stages of dealing with, or 5 or more stages of dealing with a crisis. I won't ask the Greeks in the room to go through whether you went through every stage of this, but think where it translates into action to resolve a crisis. And you have, in the first stage, think back even as early as late 2009, it was bringing out the fire brigade, trying to work out how to deal with the crisis, put out the fires. We then moved towards trying to work out who was to blame and saying, it was you, it wasn't me. Stage 3, maybe from about May 2010 right up to 2013, was frantic activity at European level. Dozens of European councils all trying to resolve things and resulting in a plethora of new governance mechanisms, new institutions being developed, new procedures being set up. And then there's a kind of pause, maybe 18 months ago, which led to trying to reach agreement on a new model. And we're now in the stage where it really gets serious. How do you implement all this? Now, to flesh out what I've just been saying, consider what's happened since the onset of the crisis. This is just a very quick flavour of the things that have been done. We've had all kinds of mechanisms aimed at trying to improve fiscal discipline, from the revised Stability and Growth Pact, the Fiscal Compact, the 2-pack, etc. We've then had other attempts to shape macroeconomic developments. The macroeconomic imbalances procedure is what the first acronym means. We've had the creation of a new word in the lexicon, macroprudential supervision. We hadn't even invented this before 2009. We have attempts to set up a banking union across Europe. These are about altering the macro picture. Then we've had regulations, the financial sector, and this is Stefano's area, so I won't dwell on that. We've had all kinds of compacts. We started in 2010 with the Europe 2020. We've had Euro Plus Pact, which some of you may remember. It was a result of Angela Merkel and Nicolas Sarkozy walking hand in hand on the beach at Deauville, and then coming out with this idea of a competitiveness pact. And then others said, no, this isn't going to work, we'll bury it. We've had the Compact for Growth and Jobs given to François Hollande as his... Is that serious? I know it's the Institut Français. As soon as I mention François Hollande, they collapse. This was given to him as part of his reward for being elected. Again, it's been forgotten. We've had all kinds of packages. Anyone here remember the social investment package? You possibly remember, looking at the age distribution here, the youth guarantees. We've had recent attempts to get something going in climate change. And in the background, the European budget, followed up last year with the invention by Jean-Claude Juncker of the European Fund for Strategic Investment, the 315 billion euro miracle package that was going to relaunch investment. So all of this has been going on since the start of the crisis. I think you'll agree it corresponds to frenetic activity. But what does it leave behind? Well, we still don't, despite 2.5 stages of banking union, have a clear-cut mechanism by which there is a fiscal backstop to bank resolution. It may come, it may be that the European Stability Mechanism does it, but it's still left hanging, and we're uncertain about it. And it's not clear to what extent it remains a national problem in national resolution boards, or eventually there will be some attempt to Europeanize it, something I'll come back to. The trouble with this is that it's a resolution fund which is going to build up over 10 years. And when are the challenges likely to arise? They're today. So we have a fund due to be functioning in 10 years' time, not that enormous anyway, and challenges likely to occur today if any banks go bust. Also lacking any attempt at debt mutualization. Eurobonds is an expression you're not allowed to use in Berlin, probably also not in Helsinki or The Hague. But it may just be possible to think in terms of some new approach, either to default or, to use the rather coded expression of the German Council of Economic Advisors, a redemption mechanism of some sort. There is at least an outline now of something called EDIS, the European Deposit Insurance Scheme, which was announced last month. We lack, however, any collective European-wide or Eurozone-wide fiscal stabilization capacity. It's been mentioned, and then they've shied away from it because it's too scary. And my last point on this, what's lacking, is that in many areas we don't yet see a return to normal, whatever normal means. But in one respect, consider it, the credit crunch. How easy is it for a small business in Greece or Italy to get finance? The answer is extremely tricky because of the crunch in the banking system and the persistence of non-performing loans. Therefore, we have to get our crystal balls out and think what happens next. And for the benefit of the translation, I'll read this out. Look to the future, because that is where you will spend the rest of your life. Obvious, isn't it? So, you all know who he is. He's an Italian, Mario Draghi. What does he have to face? What are the challenges that he has to face in the future? One is he has to do something that central banks have been trying to avoid for the last 30 or 40 years, which is to create inflation. We lack inflation. And that means making sure that he gets his quantitative easing system working without upsetting the Germans too much. Second, he has to worry about financial stability. There is a new single supervisory mechanism. He has to make that work. He has to make sure that banks recapitalize sufficiently. And somewhere along the line, he has to get involved in setting up this European deposit insurance system. Then, normal lending, what I've just been talking about. And that's especially the case in the weakest Euro area countries, including Italy, possibly also including France, where lending has been struggling. He needs to shift the balance and say the central bank has done enough, it must now be over to the governments to act. So that's a tricky agenda for Mario Draghi. Now these two, if I show their faces in Britain and say, who are they? 99.9% of the audience said, no idea. Put up your hands if you think you can identify both of them. and who can't identify either of them. You see, Greek audiences are far more informed than British audiences. The two presidents of Europe, Jean-Claude Juncker and Donald Tusk, they need to establish authority, and they need to restore the relevance of the EU level. They need something to work out, something on British membership. Clearly, their agenda ought to be, maybe isn't sufficiently, growth and jobs, in spite of all the talk about it. The new 315 billion package has to work better. Is it new money or not? This is a major question around it. They need to regulate better, because it's not just one of David Cameron's demands, it's also something that gets in the way of effective workings of the European level. They need to move forward on the digital and energy single markets. And they have to be aware of the social tensions which erupt in so many countries. A complicated agenda. Plus, get round to the next stages of completing the architecture of the euro. That's the governance challenge. And then her. This is a picture when Portugal lost a goal. Germans scored against Portugal and she leapt in the air. What does she have to do? Well, she has to sort out this tension between what the Germans want and what the EU wants. Is it always going to be this storyline around austerity, austerity, austerity plus structural reforms, and then we'll think about solidarity? Or can she open her generosity books a bit? She's worried that France and Italy are the next problem countries. And she needs to ensure that when Matteo Renzi or François Hollande or Manuel Valls comes knocking and says, can you ease the constraints on us, that they don't go too far, because it is going to create imbalance. And yet the Germans are the major cause of imbalance. She has a domestic challenge with the Bundesbank. They don't like what the European Central Bank is doing. She has to sort out a package. She has to work out, is she on Cameron's side or not in this negotiation? And then she has to think about re-election. Or, if you believe recent soundings, maybe she should be engaging in succession planning. And then we have this guy on the motorbike. I'm not sure who the driver is, but it doesn't look to me like Heather. So I'm guessing it might just be somebody whose name begins with V. I call him Euclid, you call him Evclides. For Euclid, I would say that he has to sort out the loss of momentum that occurred from about the middle of 2014. Things were starting to get better, and even this week in Katimirini, there was the article about the new Euro Plus monitor saying Greece has gone backwards, and that going backwards is the major challenge. He's got these four sorts of tensions to reconcile. Yes, jobs is essential. Social problems are acute. The public administration needs reform, but the economy also has to be modernized. And in particular, where are the exports? The Greek export to GDP ratio is amongst the lowest in the EU, and that is not tenable, because that's not something that's going to... I've said this to successive Greek finance ministers, and none of them believes me. And then he has to keep smiling at Mr. Schäuble and Mr. Dijsselbloem, make sure that they don't take offense at what he's saying. So to sum up, I'll give you some perspectives on this. I hope I'm not abusing my time, Dimitri. One, we can probably say that the worst of the crisis is over, but the patient has come out of it looking very sickly. There isn't the resilience around that you'd expect, and that in itself is a major governance challenge. Second, the roadmap for the next stages of governance is there, with the 4 and then the 5 presidents' reports and the follow-up to that. But each step in this is taken very hesitantly. The politicians say, we can't do much this year on the 5 presidents' report because there's going to be a French election in 2017 and a German election, so we'll kick it into the future. We won't confront it yet, the difficult dossiers such as Eurobonds, because they would play badly in these elections. We have to fear, and here I think it's a problem particularly for the southern European countries, that divergence is going to get worse. And particular reasons is that we need to look at growth potential. Now I understand, just talking earlier to Stefano Micossi, that there are now 500,000 young Italians in London alone. Greeks have been departing en masse. And this means that growth potential is going to be diminished if it isn't addressed and some kind of solution is found. Because if you lose the young, creative elements of your society, things are going to get worse rather than better. And this is a phrase that Luca and I were concocting the other day. We all talk about the optimal currency area and how the euro is not one. But I'd like to suggest to you in finishing a new concept, which is that what we lack is an optimal political economy in which the views on how to deal with governance challenges are reconciled across people who have very different preferences. Can Germans start to think like Greeks or vice versa? Can they employ the same concepts in trying to analyze the economy? I think it's a very tricky question and one that deserves some future research. And I'll leave you with another quote from a very tall American economist. Again, I'll read it out for the benefit of translation. Politics is not the art of the possible. It consists in choosing between the disastrous and the unpalatable. And on that relatively pessimistic note, thank you very much for listening.
I would like to thank Professor Begg for a very interesting presentation with much substance, but also, as typically is the case, very entertaining as well. Thank you. So we'll now pass to Zsolt Darvas. Zsolt is a senior fellow at the Brussels-based think tank, Bruegel, which is one of the top economic think tanks globally. He's also senior research fellow at the Institute of Economics of the Hungarian Academy of Sciences and the Cornelius University of Budapest. His research interests include macroeconomics, international economics, finance and time series analysis, and his current work focuses on policy-related issues such as the growth challenge, already mentioned, and European economic governance. You have the floor.
Thank you very much, Dimitris, for the kind introduction, and also, first of all, thank you very much for having me here. It's always a pleasure to come to Greece. I have to say Greece is the country I travel the most. But I'm very happy that this time I don't have to talk about Greece, but instead about economic governance in the EU. And I think Iain has started with an excellent note highlighting that we are far from an optimal political economy, with which I very much agree. And some of the suggestions I will say toward the end of my presentation will also reflect this recognition. But since 15 minutes is not that long, I thought to start to summarize the key points I would like to make, and we will see how much time I will have to explore these points in more detail. Now, the first one is very simple, and I won't spend much time on that, in which I just simply recall that the pre-crisis economic governance of the European Union clearly failed. There was a belief that price stability and fiscal rules would be sufficient to ensure stable and durable growth. This was clearly not the case. I don't want to spend much time on that. I just would like to recall that it has changed. So it failed. And certainly this failure has been recognized, and it prompted many, new institutions, pacts, whatsoever. And Iain's slide very much nicely summarized all the various new institutions and pacts and rules and regulations which have been agreed in the past 5 or 6 years. I will show some charts, some empirical results, which highlight that the new or the revamped fiscal rules do not really work in a sense that they are not implemented. Also, we have now macroeconomic imbalances rules. I refer to the macroeconomic imbalances procedure. They don't work either. They are not implemented either. A second issue I will discuss, and a key conclusion is that economic policy coordination within the European Union does not work either. So one of the major goals of most of these pacts is to improve economic governance, and by that it's frequently mean a better economic policy coordination. I think it doesn't work. The third point here under number 2, with which I'm more optimistic, is that the banking union was inevitable. I agree with Iain that it's incomplete, but I think it was not just inevitable, but also so far has been a major success. And the third major point is looking to the future. I mean, I don't think the euro would collapse. I mean, here I say it may not collapse. I can say even more straightforward way that I don't think the euro will collapse, even though I do see some such predictions even nowadays. But I also think that what we have currently is suboptimal. And suboptimality has a number of unpleasant consequences, meaning less than possible economic growth, uneven economic development, social pain and hardship in some parts of Europe for long, and certainly this is sad to say. And translating this suboptimality to economic governance of the EU and in particular the euro area, I would like to highlight that the banking union is incomplete. Drawing from Iain's conclusion that we are far from an optimal political economy, I also conclude that certain decentralization, namely decentralization of structural reform issues and also fiscal surveillance would be desirable, and I think it would be an improvement. But at the same time, along with this decentralization of national issues, letting countries to do what they really want, some centralized functions would be needed, and in particular, a centralized fiscal stabilization instrument, in my view, would be rather beneficial. Now, I used 1/3 of my time, but at least I could deliver my main messages. So let me show you a few charts substantiating these conclusions. I said I don't want to talk much about the pre-crisis governance framework, but I think it's important to highlight what was the basic belief or the basic principle of the economic governance in the EU. Is that one thing is that fiscal discipline and price stability, these two major pillars would be sufficient to achieve a stable and durable growth. And for the fiscal discipline, we had the Stability and Growth Pact. Otherwise, we had these so-called broad economic policy guidelines, which aim to help countries identifying their key issues that they should consider. The European Commission had many long and sometimes quite good reports, but they were excessively long, and on page 266 they said that there may be a problem with the credit boom in Ireland, but this has not received much attention. So the end result was the build-up of major macroeconomic imbalances, which I think is really difficult problem to handle, and we are still not yet done. And even the Stability and Growth Pact failed to keep public debt at a tolerable level, and in particular in Greece and Italy. And also on the financial side, which is at the side of economic issues, there was, I think, a major contradiction between a single monetary policy, a single market for goods, services, people, and capital, on the one hand, and national policies for various financial issues like supervision, bank supervision, resolution, and bailout. And the two major issues is that this dichotomy distorted the playing field on the one hand, and it became a major source of financial instability. Now, on economic policy coordination, the European semester now is the major framework through which economic policy coordination is conducted, and it includes many items. Starts with the so-called annual growth survey by the European Commission, in which it highlights the major priorities for the given year. Countries submit their own programs. This semester is also used to enforce the European Union's fiscal rules and also the new macroeconomic imbalances rules. And at the end, each semester concludes with recommendations, both for each of the 28 European Union country and also for the euro area as a whole. Now, what we did with my colleague Álvaro Leandro is that we calculated a simple European semester reform implementation index, calculated, but we used the European Commission own assessment. So the European Commission makes a different number of recommendations for each country, varying between, let's say, 4 and 8. And for each of them, they assess on a scale whether there is no progress or fully implemented. So we gave some simple scores. And then we calculated the average across countries, both for the EU as a whole and separately for the euro area and for the non-euro area countries. And what you can see here, I mean, this index is between 0 and 1. You can see that initially the index was about 0.4, and it has gradually declined even since. So even at the start of the European semester, I would regard this 0.4 as a relatively low rate of implementation, but it has declined even further, both in the euro area and non-euro area. And certainly currently we can assess the 2014 recommendations. The 2015 recommendations will be assessed next year. I mean, we will see how it will evolve. But clearly, the recommendations which are made have not been really implemented, or to a very limited extent. Now, what is even more striking is that the OECD has a so-called Going for Growth report in every second year, and they gave recommendations for each OECD member countries. So we picked those 16 European Union countries which are also members of the OECD, and plotted the implementation index of the OECD and our own calculations, and you can see they are almost perfectly coincide. You know, the European semester recommendations are based on a huge, effort for more than half a year. Many institutions, countries, working groups, whatsoever, come together to discuss what should be done, how it should be made. By the OECD certainly have bilateral talks with countries, but there is no surveillance, no sanctions whatsoever are added to that. And you can see they are almost the same, and the overlap between the recommendation only partly explains. We also looked at how much OECD recommendations and European semester recommendations overlap, and it only partly explains. And I think it paints really a dismal picture about the European semester, because I mean, if it's despite all the huge efforts which are put in this new economic governance framework of the EU, it is not implemented at a higher rate than the unilateral OECD recommendations, then it suggests that this system doesn't work. Now, we also looked at separately the Stability and Growth Pact recommendations, the macroeconomic imbalances procedure recommendations, and those recommendations which don't belong to any of these, because certainly some recommendations have no legal obligation for the countries to implement. They should consider, but they are not obliged. But even for the Stability and Growth Pact, you can see that which is the light blue, which has the strongest legal framework and the strongest enforcement framework, even it's relatively low. And for example, in 2014, it was not much different from the rest. So again, we concluded that this new economic governance framework doesn't really work, in the sense that, according to the own assessment of the Commission, countries don't implement what they should implement. So I think it paints a very dark picture about this new framework. And we also looked at a couple of other issues. As I said, there are recommendations for both each country and for the euro area as a whole. Now we looked at whether the recommendations which were made for the euro area are well reflected in country-specific recommendations, and we concluded that, with the exception of services market reform, which is almost everywhere, the others are not. Also, the Council of Ministers of Finance, they are very happy, and also the Commission, to speak about the so-called aggregate fiscal stance of the euro area. But again, if you look at what these reports include, I mean, we concluded that it's no more than a simply empty rhetoric. I mean, there is no substance to that. Nobody defines what is the optimal aggregate fiscal stance. Nobody defines how it should be distributed among the countries. What the Commission does is simply adds up what each country is doing, and then says that, okay, I mean, this is broadly okay. So, I mean, there are debates whether this aggregate fiscal stance issue makes sense or not, but since the Council of Finance Ministers in each year in the past 4 years make a recommendation that the aggregate fiscal stance should be aligned with the cyclical situation of the euro area and in line with the sustainability issues, but they simply don't use this concept just to name. And also the third point is also very important, which I personally believe is very important, is that quite rightly in 2012, 13 and 14, the Council made recommendations for a more symmetric adjustment. So, which means basically that not just deficit countries like Greece and Spain or Italy has to adjust, but also surplus countries like Germany and the Netherlands, which have very large current account surpluses, should adjust. For example, boosting demand, boosting investment at home to reduce their surpluses, increase some imports to help these countries. So I was very much welcome that these recommendations was made in 12, 13, and 14. But somehow by this year it has disappeared, and again, this is my assessment. It's very bad development. Now, my time is running out, and I still would have a lot to say. So then let me just say a few things and then conclude, and almost skip almost fully the banking issues. Is that I do see a really major problem with policy coordination in the EU, is that basically policy coordination, the economic governance framework works by that national representatives come together in different councils at different levels, and they are basically the decision makers. Now, they can discuss whatever in Brussels or wherever they meet, but then when they go home, then they have to sell it to their national parliaments, and even more importantly, to the national people. So, I mean, those people, those politicians who are accountable to the national parliaments and want to be re-elected, I mean, they will primarily focus on what their country really wants, and I see no problem with that. I mean, François Hollande, wants to prefer security over the Stability and Growth Pact. I mean, it may be his preferences, or Mr. Renzi would like to see some more flexibility on the fiscal rules because he believes the potential output is badly measured by the European Commission. I mean, I don't see any problem with that. But if we have this, I mean, duality that national countries who want to follow national interests come together to coordinate, they may be able to find, some good compromises if there's a huge pressure. For example, the banking union, I think, was a major success, as I said. It came when there was a real existential threat to the euro. But when this threat is removed and the ECB started to implement various policies which calmed markets, then everybody again became national. So for this reason, I don't really see that economic policy coordination can work more efficiently in whatever way we will do, and the 5-president report includes a number of suggestions how to do that. Some I think are well justified. With some others, I'm more pessimistic. But overall, I don't really think that it can work better. So my conclusion is that certain decentralization efforts could increase ownership and also in general welfare. And one of such decentralization is the so-called national competitiveness boards, which were included in the 5% reports, which are basically national boards, national councils, which will composed of national experts, and they will assess what problems the country have and can hopefully give an independent advice to the government what needs to be done. And since this comes from national voices, probably the governments may consider these suggestions more seriously compared to when they receive the recommendation coming from Brussels. So I very much welcome this idea. And also, again, the 5% report aims to have a much greater involvement in national governments and parliaments and national social partners in the whole process of the European semester, and discussion and also in the decision of reform process, which I think will improve. So with these decentralization measures, I very much agree. Although I also have the second point here, that why I think this will help. I don't think it will help much to internalize better external spillovers. For example, to make a concrete example, I don't think that the German government will cut corporate taxes to boost corporate investment in Germany, or increase much more public investment just because to help other countries. I think this will never happen. So a couple of other proposals, but now I skip, and just for the banking union, I just highlight a contradiction that A lot of things have been done, which I think very much welcome. First of all, the single supervisory mechanism, I think, is working quite well. I think so far it has passed all the tests, and the ECB is doing a great job. It will likely make mistakes. I mean, every supervisor can make mistakes, but so far it's doing well. The single resolution mechanism will be, I mean, it still needs to be seen how it will work. It will start in a few weeks, in January. But these are largely centralized, but at the same time, deposit guarantee system is still national. Fiscal backstop is primarily national. It was also mentioned by Iain. And also the lender of last resort function, which aims to provide liquidity to banks when they are solvent but illiquid, are partly centralized because the European Central Bank has many facilities for those banks which have sufficient collateral to pledge, but also partly national. For example, in Greece, Ireland and Portugal and some other countries, the so-called emergency liquidity assistance has been used widely, and this is at the book of the national central bank, so if something goes wrong, then it will be basically the loss of the country itself. And therefore, what is so-called sovereign banking doom loop, whereby weak banks can turn down the sovereign and the weak sovereign can turn down the banks, has been reduced but not been fully eliminated. So I think there is a contradiction which needs to be improved. I do think that really truly European deposit guarantee system would improve the resilience of the banking union much more, and also more risk sharing would be clearly welcome. And the Commission made a lot of proposals. I mean, the major German objection is that risk reduction is needed instead of risk sharing. I mean, I think both are needed. But since my time is well over, I mean, let me skip. On the last slide, I put again my main conclusions. Is that the pre-crisis governance framework clearly failed. There were a number of reforms. Some were, I think, quite promising, like the banking union, though it's incomplete. Some were so far less effective, mostly the economic governance framework. And I think the euro will not collapse, but we have is a suboptimal system, and certainly there will be many, many ways to improve it further. So let me stop here and thank you for your attention.
Thanks, Zsolt Darvas, for a very interesting overview of issues and many stuff that remain to be completed, unfortunately. So we move on to Stefano Micossi, who is Director General of ASSONIME and visiting professor at the College of Europe. Previously, he has served as Director General for Industry in the European Commission, Director of Economic Research at Confindustria, and Director of International Research at the Bank of Italy, Italy's Research Department. He has published extensively on macroeconomic, financial, and institutional affairs, and writes editorial comments for Affari Finance at the weekly economic supplement of La Repubblica. Stefano, you have the floor.
I think what I'm going to say fits fairly well with the two previous presentations, because we were uncoordinated, but we are in full agreement. Let me show first some data, and then we discuss the implications. Chart 1, divergence. I don't think people are aware of the degree of divergence in productivity development that we've been building up in this system. The blue line is the peaks. And much of this development in the blue line is due to Italy and Spain, actually. What is striking in this chart is the fact that total factor productivity, these are the conference board data, literally precipitates with the beginning of the euro. And if you run a structural break test, you find that there is a structural break. So the bad news is that the euro became the occasion for a collapse of productivity in the periphery. I don't think we are fully aware of this, and I think we should start looking at this for all it implies. Behind this, these are the World Bank indicators of the quality of institutions, the quality of governance. The first to use these extensively were Andreas Bolto and Wendy Carlin in a beautiful paper a few years back. I'm replicating. The data are now on the World Bank website. Anybody can use and replicate these charts. What has happened since the beginning of the euro? Well, it's a collapse in the quality of governance institutions in the periphery. And again, a major contribution here is Italy for sure. France has not improved. There is a problem. What does it mean? It means that on the entire front on the rule of law, simplification, the judiciary, market opening, we went the wrong way. Now, unfortunately, the hypothesis, why is this, what does he want from us? Go away. Okay. Unfortunately, you see, government effectiveness, regulatory core, and the control of corruptions, and the rule of law. And then you can aggregate this. So rather than convergence, we got divergence. And unfortunately, the best explanation that we can find about this is very simple. The Eurozone at the beginning became a fantastic mechanism for monetary laxity, which was exploited, as the Germans would have feared, to run a big party, and these are the results. In a separate paper on the monetary policy of the ECB, which was published in July as a special report by SEPS, I show that the common monetary policy, in fact, fed divergence in a monstrous manner. So we get divergence, and it was the euro. Okay, it was not something else. Good. This is the first part of the big party, the southern party, if you wish. But then there is also another party. What happens now? It doesn't go anymore. Down, up. Doesn't go anymore. Why do you do this to me? Page up, page down. No. Suivant, précédent. Let's try this one. Yes. Yes, but it's not. Yes, it's going. Okay. Now we come to Germany. What were they doing in the Eurozone? This chart shows their strong preference for a stable nominal exchange rate. You see, the red index is the general index of effective exchange rate, real. The other one is against euro area. Very clearly, up until the moment we fixed exchange rates within the euro, the Deutschmark was typically appreciating to compensate for their average gain in relative productivities. So more or less, their price competitiveness was oscillating around it, but it was fairly stable. And the nominal exchange rate was compensating appreciation for their steady gain in relative productivity. Well, after we blocked the exchange rate within the Eurozone, the green line is what happens to the real exchange rate within the Eurozone of the Deutschmark. Of course, they have a preference for stable exchange rate. And this is what has happened to competitiveness, price competitiveness. In the middle, you have the average core, the down line, which is really the limit of the entire region. You have Germany. And then the blue line is again the peaks. Beware, Germany has substantially appreciated in real terms against every other currencies in the system, including in terms of relative prices, of course, we are talking, including Finland, the Netherlands, Austria, you name it. So this is a system in which the anchor country has gained a huge competitive advantage, which is not going away. Of course, the result of this has been an enormous, an explosion in the German balance of trade, which was the main driver of growth in Germany throughout 2007, 2008, while trade with the other areas, as you may see, was stable. Only after the rest of the Eurozone stopped buying BMWs, the crisis, then you see export shifting to other markets, which were conveniently expanding again at that time. This enormous, of course we are aware, enormous increase in the balance rate was financed by German banks, which built unsustainable position vis-à-vis the periphery. We were importing on credit. So now we look at the picture at the end of the game, unit labor cost, productivity, and labor cost. So 2000 and 2007, of course, you have this enormous, the little red rombo, how do you call it, shows the net of nominal wage increases and minus productivity increases, okay? So basically, German unit labor cost was zero throughout the first 8 years. You see France, Italy, you see Spain, which was highly divergent. We know of the real estate boom and all that. But we also see the Netherlands. Poland did well. They were exploiting the enlargement boom. Portugal, big problem, and so on, and Greece. Now, 2008, 2014. Germany is no longer the outlier in this. Their costs, nominal costs, have started to increase again. So the impact of the health reform and a number of other factors is fading away. They now have a decent increase in nominal costs. Productivity they don't have. There is no productivity increase. The anchor country produces no productivity increase. Interesting because this is our anchor. Look, France and Italy, well, they are basically, they're a bit better than Germany, but they are not gaining much. So the divergence will not diminish. The great change has been, of course, in Spain, Portugal, and Greece, where there has been amazing progress. But this is a small part of the game, unfortunately, and not a big part of the game. The balance of payment of Germany, they have this huge surplus, blue. It is not compensated by FDIs, as it was, for instance, under Bretton Woods, by FDIs out of America into the rest of the West. It is compensated by portfolio flows that go elsewhere because of confidence problem. So the imbalance is not adjusted and is not financed within the Eurozone. And with the data, there is more here. I will just mention one, if yes. This chart is complicated. It shows basically that the only means of financing during the crisis was the red stuff. The red stuff is target 2. There was no private capital flowing to the periphery, and in fact, private capital was flowing out of the periphery through the open window of target 2, the central bank open window. You can get out through there without losses, right? Okay, and then the debt doesn't go away. These are the IMF forecasts beyond 2015, but you can see that debt to GDP ratios are going down at the core. It is really Germany, but they are not going down at all in the periphery. Okay, this is the picture. What is the policy debate? I wanted to show these charts because I'm really reflecting on the long term. In his beautiful book on the European Central Bank, Harold James says in the introduction that monetary unions tend to break down after 15 years. It's a rather sinister prediction, because we are right there. Maybe we've now learned that there is a strong political capital invested in this. When we come close to breakdown, in reality, we come back from the brink. We really would like to keep this stuff, despite the fact that, as Martin Wolf will say later, this is a rather unhappy marriage, dysfunctional, he says, dysfunctional marriage. But now, where is the discussion today about governance? I think you've heard Zsolt has shown that it doesn't work. The common governance apparatus is losing credibility again, because it obviously is not working. And the emphasis now is on decentralizing. Decentralizing what? Well, the discussion that is underway in reality about decentralization of decision is the discussion of creating a system in which each country takes fully upon itself again all the risk of idiosyncratic shocks. And the way, there are a number of papers coming out, non-papers, of the German Chancellery and of the Ministry of Finance in Germany. There is one which was published yesterday by Sole 24 Ore, which was sent, secret document, but this is on the papers, by the Ministry of Finance to the German Parliament. It says this: we have to build a system in which, before we complete banking union, all the debt, sovereign debt legacy must be out of the banks in the periphery. And the way to do it is to put a risk weight on sovereigns in the bank balance sheets and to put a cap on their exposure to sovereigns. On this, the European Systemic Risk Board is now elaborating a proposal. There's a committee chaired by Marco Pagano. And then there is the junior bond proposal, a bail-in for sovereigns. The idea is that countries start issuing, when their debt to GDP ratio is above a number, guess what, maybe 60%? Yeah, then, or maybe you are not in respect of the MTO objectives, then what you do, then you have to issue, gradually build up an amount of subordinated obligations that are automatically restructured, lose value, if you need financial assistance from the ESM. This is the Clemens Fust proposal. Clemens Fust is the guy who took over from Hans Wernes in IFO. So this is what is decentralization. We want to build a system in which, since we don't trust the governance anymore, rather than risk sharing, we have risk segregation and bail-in all over the place. The Five Presidents report, read it carefully, basically says, first we fix the divergence, then we talk about the rest. I think Iain said it very clearly. And the rest anyway is after 2017, and for the time being there is only one element in which it was envisaged that we could go ahead. That element was the deposit insurance. But deposit insurance is once again stuck, because the problem is we will not share the risk with you of a new banking crisis, since you have too much sovereigns inside the bank's balance sheet. So this is where we are. Of course, this is a recipe for very slow growth. This is a recipe for 0.75 growth in the long term. There is no question. Because the ceiling to growth is the low growth of Germany. It is as simple as that. Because if we do more with these price divergences, we will soon hit the balance of payments constraint. We will be immediately brought back to order with deflation. So this is a system at 0.75% growth. Of course, we cannot handle the debt with that. Do we have... of course, the centralized solution is very clear. You give me a Minister of Finance who will come and change your budget if you don't do it. You're not in compliance. the discussion about the Minister of Finance is about this. Since the Commission is no longer trusted anymore, so people are thinking of new mechanisms centered around the Eurogroup. We don't like the Commission sometimes because we think she is too rigid. In Germany, they think the Commission is totally unreliable because she's given up on everything serious with Italy or France. This is where we are. This is the discussion. Do we see ways out of this? Today, there is no appetite for centralizing sovereignty. So this is not in the cards. So what is left open in substance to us is this divergent decentralization. The decentralization is divergence, with two extra ingredients. The Juncker plan, which will not work unless, and the internal market. Some of you mentioned it in their slides. Okay, here there would be a game to play, which is this. Since we cannot continue with this system with segregated markets, then we have to be serious about opening the markets. Playing integration aggressively again is the only way to keep together a system like this and take it out of deflation. What are we talking about? We are talking about the chapters of integration which have been on the table forever, but where progress is very slow. We are talking of opening up, first of all, network utility services. We need to open up telephony and accept that we will go from 20 operators to 3, which is the American picture for mobile communications. We have to open up energy and accept, well, this is good news for us, that Italy, which has an enormous overcapacity, will be allowed to offer its electricity on the German market, where 4 monopolists impede entry for anyone. I'm over. So, and transport. But more, we need to open up direct investment flows, capital flows. Our capital markets are not open. You need the political permission to move. We need to open up the labor markets, which are closed. So, in my view, the next game is integration. There is no appetite for that either. But I think we will not get out of this with a negotiation over policy, for the reasons I think Iain explained very well. So this is my alternative. I don't have another one.
Thank you very much, Stefano Micossi. A very, very interesting and thought-provoking presentation. Not very happy, though, at the end. We'll now move on to Nikos Christodoulakis. Nikos Christodoulakis is a professor of economic analysis at the Athens University of Economics and Business. He's also research associate with the Hellenic Observatory at the European Institute at the LSE. He has published several books and numerous articles in international journals in economic policy, fluctuations and growth. And his book, The Greek Endgame, From Austerity to Growth or Grexit, has just been published very recently in the UK. And I urge you to read it. You have the floor.
And I would like to congratulate Iain Begg for taking the initiative to bring this issue forward. Because here in Greece, we adore to talk about past mistakes or past wonders. But I think we devote such a little time to talk about what's going to happen in the future. Unless, of course, we face it in a future time, talking again about the past. So I think that debates like this may incentivize a lot of people, intellectuals and politicians, in order to shape a better opinion on how the future in the European Union and the Euro area in particular is going to be. Let me start with two statements on the economic governance as it has been shaped so far. The first thing is that it is obvious that it's still behind what it would constitute an optimal currency area, or as Iain put it in the beginning of the presentations, an optimal political economy. But I think it's also valid to say, and fair, that it's miles away from the situation that existed 5 or 6 years ago in the European Union, a situation characterized by indecision and vagueness on how to deal with the crisis which impacted the Union at that time. The second point is that because it was designed after the crisis, it bears the footprint of this crisis. And I think that this may instill some bias in the way that instruments and policies are designed and are going to be implemented. And it is particularly this bias which I'm going to analyze in my talk, hoping that in the time which is left before the actual implementation of the plan, several things can be corrected and optimized. Looking at what exactly the design so far is about, one can realize very quickly that there are a number of asymmetries which may make the whole scheme not so efficiently working in the future. The banking union is an essential pillar of the new framework, and this is going on, and one hopes that within a couple of years, perhaps, major issues are going to be settled. And then the economic governance framework brings 2 new pillars. The first pillar is how fiscal management is going to be conducted in the European Union. And the second pillar is how competitiveness and productivity developments are going to be analyzed and faced in case they are negative. But there is a big difference, a big asymmetry between these 2 pillars. The first pillar is very well articulated. It provides for a European fiscal board, which is going to supervise the fiscal position of member countries and the European Union as a whole. It provides for national fiscal boards. Some of them have been already established. It has a very solid institutional framework, such as, for example, the Stability and Growth Pact. And also there is plenty of policy instruments around in order to carry out the targets of fiscal stabilization, such as, for example, the fiscal compact, the 6-packs, the 2-pack, all these type of things. But if you look at the architecture of the second pillar, everything is very poor. For example, there is no competitiveness board on the European level. It is true that the second pillar foresees the establishment of a competitiveness board at a national level. But if you look at the details, it's very vague. There is no institutional framework to define what is competitiveness, what is productivity, and you saw in the previous presentation that the total factor productivity shows a big divergence in the euro area. And finally, there is no policy framework. There is a vague description about competitiveness and amelioration of productivity and all these type of things, but the only thing which has been said so far is the 6% limit on the current account either way. And if you show carefully the one slide which was shown by Mr. Micossi before, so that the German current account surplus has been fallen slightly below 6% in order to comply with this criterion. But otherwise, we have a powerful fiscal management armory and a toothless framework in order to promote productivity and competitiveness in member states. And I think that this asymmetry is going to exert some very serious consequences for the future of the Eurozone. Asymmetry number 2. Talking about fiscal management, everyone understands that it goes both ways. But what we see today is one-sided feedback rule. So if deficits become excessive or if public debt becomes excessive, then something has to be done about it. But there is no talk about what's going to happen if one country accumulates too many surpluses or it has too low debt. Of course, it's very difficult to argue against a nation which is too thrifty. But if you're in an economic union, I think the thriftiness of one member state may affect the economic activity of the other. So I think that as it is at present, the fiscal policy framework instills a recession bias in the euro area. And then, of course, it's going to instill an unemployment bias. It is no coincidence that the euro area in particular is the single economic union which has not seriously reduced the unemployment rate since 2009. All other comparable countries, United States, the Nordic countries, United Kingdom, Japan, everybody has reduced unemployment by serious amounts, except the euro area. So I think that one correction of this asymmetry should be that fiscal policy becomes bidirectional and activates some fiscal instruments when debt or deficits become excessive, but also activate some fiscal expansion if they become too large surpluses or too low debt. And this will create spillovers which will somehow contain the recessionary effects in other member states which undertake to implement a contractionary fiscal policy. Asymmetry number 3. It's the familiar debate, which is the most efficient fiscal instrument to use. Well, let's see the facts first. First of all, managing public expenditure may be politically difficult and socially uneven. Why? Because government expenditure affects specific sectors of the economy or specific categories of the population. And this makes it sometimes operationally risky to change very abruptly and to a large extent government expenditure. So if you rely to achieve fiscal targets by just manipulating the government expenditure, this may have some adverse effects either in the political framework or in economic efficiency as well. And this impact differentiation, I think, is going to become the Achilles heel of the plan, if not corrected promptly. On the other hand, there is the tax adjustment, which may include the general rate of income tax, the VAT rate, the lump sum taxation, or even the social security contributions. All these changes, they affect a larger part of society, and they have more widespread effects in the economy. So they are more easily to manage from a political point of view. But of course, this has some cost, because this creates investment uncertainty, it raises factor costs, and of course it produces inflation effects, especially when you raise the VAT rate. But otherwise, I think that a tax instrument should be politically more preferable and perhaps socially more balanced in achieving fiscal targets. But this is just one side of the coin, because the flip side of the coin regards effectiveness. And if you try to correlate tax levels across the euro area countries with changes in debt, you see that the tax is a very inefficient instrument to use. It has a very poor correlation with the changes in debt. So the conclusion is that if you rely on tax changes, despite its political appeal, you may not be as efficient in carrying out debt targets. On the other hand, expenditure is having the problems which I referred to before, but it seems to be a lot more effective in containing debt. So I think that at this point, one should strike a balance between effectiveness and the easiness of politically managing the fiscal change. And I think that the best solution to this problem is to try to find a combination of fiscal rules, which I'm going to explain a bit later. There is another asymmetry, number 4, which is about the policy anchor. If we decide to adopt a fiscal framework in order to manipulate the fiscal instruments and achieve a target, we need to know from the very beginning which is this target. And nowadays, most analyst suggestions talk about the debt anchor. For example, in a paper which was written by many authors and it was published by IMF last May, they soundly suggest that the natural anchor of fiscal stance in each member state is the debt to GDP ratio, because this encapsulates all fiscal developments in the country. And in a recent paper which was released by the European Commission a couple of months ago, also suggests that a stronger focus on debt is required, and specifically says that the 60% rule should become operational from now on. But the shortcoming with debt, as is the case with all types of stock variables, is that they do not capture in a very stark way the oncoming changes. Let me show you something. Whatever the framework we are going to develop, we need at least to satisfy the criterion of facing the previous crisis. So let's see, if we had adopted this policy bias and we had adopted only the debt to GDP ratio as the signal of an incoming crisis, how we would be in a position to distinguish which countries are in danger in 2009. So suppose we had collected data of debt to GDP ratio between 2006 and 2008, and we were applying this policy anchor. Only Greece would have been picked up as a crisis country. We would miss Portugal, Spain, and Ireland. So let's try an alternative. Let's see, for example, how it would work if we had applied the general government deficit criterion. Well, in this case, only Greece and Portugal, they would be picked up as problematic countries. And our crisis search would miss Portugal and definitely would miss Spain. But look at the third picture. Let's suppose that we adopt the current account deficit as a signal for the oncoming crisis. Then you see that Greece, Portugal, Spain, and Ireland, all the 4 bailout countries, would have been picked up. So I suggest that perhaps we should include other indicators for oncoming crisis in order to alert the policy-making authorities on what to do about. And I think that behind the nasty picture you saw before on the deterioration of the total factor of productivity is precisely this, because the deterioration of the TFP actually has led to the vast deterioration of current account balances. So I think that in order to overcome this asymmetry and this debt bias, I think we should include the general government balances as an extra indicator, as well as current account balances as a possible signaling of a forthcoming crisis. Finally, I think that the instruments which have to be employed are required to try to combine public expenditure instruments and also tax revenues instruments. And of course, the fiscal management which is going to be adopted needs to prepare very carefully on which items on the expenditure side and which items on the revenue side can be so efficiently manipulated in order to achieve the fiscal target timely. For example, I would suggest that you can earmark some performance bonuses in the public sector, overtime pay, auxiliary benefits, traveling allowances, and all these type of things, which can easily change when fiscal pressure is developed. And on the tax revenue side, I think perhaps we need to adopt a flexible VAT margin, income tax and social security contributions. To some extent, they may change as well, and then find an optimal combination of both instruments in order to implement fiscal correction whenever this is needed. In particular, I think that changes in the VAT rate are perhaps, in my view, the most appropriate to use. First of all, because it's administratively easy. It covers all the economy and all sectors of society, probably not to the same effect, to the same extent, but I think it has wide repercussions. And also it's more keen to the European objectives because it is the byproduct of the single market. So I think that, in my view, this is the most ideal fiscal instrument which can be used in the future. And then, of course, we need to adopt a periodic review of how this fiscal stabilization performs and how the debt profiles and deficit profiles are going to develop in the future in order to improve through time this fiscal management. Finally, I think that some countries, and Greece is one of them, they need some national complements of this fiscal governance framework. And I think that they should not allow the fiscal governance to be understood by the public as a new memorandum, as a new conditionality, which aims in order to deepen recession in that particular country. So I think that Greece, for example, and probably other countries, they have to make some institutional preparation which will be attuned to the overall economic governance framework. Such as, for example, they can devise some constitutional rules on excessive debt and deficits, but also provide some clear-cut exceptions for emergency cases. Then they have to devise and own a reform program which will try to make the economy more competitive, and actually they put some flesh on these competitiveness boards which are going to be established. And also, of course, they need an investment policy which should be a lot more powerful than the Juncker initiative, and they need to attract some major foreign investments to kickstart the economy, because otherwise, if the economy is found to be in a deep recession, I think this is going to create a very negative attitude against the economic governance of the European Union. And I think that the least thing that Greece needs is to be considered once more as an unwilling follower of European dictation, because I think that this is going to be extremely counterproductive. To avoid this risk, I think that Greece should become institutionally proactive in tune of this economic governance framework, so that this fits in a more satisfactory and politically accepted way. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Nikos Christodoulakis. I think it's very interesting to know that, as I said at the beginning, we did not ask our speakers to cover specific issues, so there was no coordination. And unlike the Eurozone, it seems our speakers were a bit more coordinated and actually seemed to agree on a number of issues. It's very interesting, and starting from the motto, if you like, that Iain Begg said at the beginning, optimal political economy, the lack of an optimal political economy. It's very interesting to know that all of them chose to focus on divergence in performance, which inevitably also lead to divergence in interests. And therefore, and this has also been reflected in divergences or different priorities, if you like, in the way the Eurozone architecture has been set up, which, as some of the speakers said, created its own problems.